As Azarian Tell gazed out over the boundless expanse of space from his command post, he couldn't help but reflect on their countless conquests. If only we had taken our time, he murmured to himself, his claws tapping rhythmically on the console. The hum of the ship's engines was a constant reminder of their relentless journey through the stars. He turned to his second-in-command, Laren, who stood silently nearby. Laren, Azarian began, do you ever wonder what might have happened if we had studied our enemies more closely? If we had learned about them, delved into their histories? Laren frowned, puzzled. What do you mean, sir? We've always been thorough in our conquests. It's how we've managed to expand the Dominion to nearly 1,000 worlds. Azarian sighed, his gaze distant. But who were they to us, Laren? The Starwalkers? They seemed so small, mere beasts compared to us. How could we have foreseen what would happen? Laren nodded slowly. I see your point, sir. We never really saw them as equals, did we? Just another species to subdue. Exactly, Azarian agreed, his voice tinged with regret. Hundreds of times, we had done the same thing, and every time, the result was the same. They submitted or were destroyed, and we moved on. But this time was different. Laren's eyes widened. You mean, the humans? Azarian nodded grimly. Yes, the humans. This one time will mark us forever in history as monsters, tyrants, slavers, and destroyers. And the worst part? We did nothing different than before. Laren looked thoughtful. Then why was this time different? What did we miss? Azarian sighed deeply. We missed their resilience, their unity in the face of an external threat. We underestimated their capacity for destruction, for sheer defiance. They were small, yes, but they were relentless. Laren's voice trembled slightly. So, what now, sir? How will we be remembered? Azarian turned to face Laren fully, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. We will be remembered as fools, 1,000 worlds and trillions of beings united under our banners, and yet our legacy will be that of foolish creatures who let an even greater evil loose on the galaxy. Laren shook his head. Is there nothing we can do to change that? Azarian placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Perhaps not now, but we can learn from this. We can teach others to respect and understand those they seek to conquer. Maybe then, we can prevent another catastrophe like this. Laren nodded, a spark of hope in his eyes. I hope you're right, sir. For the sake of the galaxy, I hope you're right. As they stood in silence, contemplating the weight of their actions, the vastness of space stretched out before them, a reminder of the many worlds they had touched and the many lives they had forever changed. I don't have much time. I write this manuscript quickly, my claws shaking with fear for the first time in 100 planetary cycles. Not since my youth and my first battles have I felt this kind of fear. But unlike then, this fear holds no excitement, no anticipation, only dread and a reluctant acceptance of the fate we have brought upon ourselves. The deeds that will lead to my people's removal from the galactic stage, and which I write about in these last few partial day cycles before their arrival. I aim to be brief, and hopefully, if fate favors me, this manuscript might be sent before they arrive. If not, I hope it might survive what they do to my body and my home. My name is Azarian Tell, Azarax. We are a proud race. Our ancestors were the top predators of our world. This heritage drove our expansion and control of a dozen other spacefaring species. But our control was not harsh. We helped those who showed their strength. We respected strength, skill, and ferocity above all else. And those species that proved themselves were raised almost as brothers, though still beneath us in the Dominion hierarchy. Other races, the cowardly herds or pre-space beings, were treated as tools. They were not our equals. They could never be the equals of even our second-tier species. They were like beasts, and we treated them as such. The Dominion was vast and powerful, with nearly 1,000 worlds and many races at its top, and hundreds more at its base. It was a pyramid of power built on the idea of an apex predator's mindset. This view blinded us, making us believe there was no other way. For nearly 4,000 years, things had gone this way. Among the other vast territories controlled by other species or groups, there was no other way. The strong ruled, and the weak obeyed. I spent my first decades learning for the sake of learning, which was rare among the Xerax. Even now, as I write on my last day, instead of preparing to defend my home, few of my kind think as I do. I believe that every species works differently, sometimes in small, almost unnoticeable ways. This drove me to study those differences. Why do herd animals not fight back after being beaten? Why do predators sometimes yield to stronger forces instead of fighting to be dominant? I asked too many questions, it seems. My reward was a post on a survey flotilla, a dull and boring job. We traveled the stars, cataloging resource deposits, marking habitable and barren worlds, and mapping hazards. The monotony was only broken by inhabited worlds, but even then, a kind of sadness stayed with me. Those were the worlds we spent the most time near, watching and studying their inhabitants. Non-sentient races were quickly marked and then ignored, but sentient ones needed study. In my time as a survey officer, I saw only 3 new sentient species. 2 were not significant, early spacefarers, and easy to subdue. They might make good slaves or low-level soldiers, cannon fodder for the Dominion. The last race, however, was the most interesting. We found them in a little system along a spiral arm of our territory, where habitable worlds were rare. These creatures had only recently achieved spaceflight, indicated by the probes, satellites, and space debris around their world. Unlike any other species, they seemed to have halted their advancement after reaching space. They explored some of their system and then apparently gave up on reaching the stars. This was baffling, and if I had been given more time to study them, we might have prevented all of this. The sensor alarm sounds. They have entered the system periphery. Less than a planetary rotation remains. There was still so much to learn. If I had more time. It always comes down to time, doesn't it? We spent most of a planetary stellar orbit observing these creatures. They would be easy to subjugate. They hadn't even formed a unified planetary system. Even stranger, they weren't like any other race we had encountered. Their fractious nature likely stemmed from their not being a herd-based race, nor an apex predator race. They appeared to be some kind of pursuit predator with omnivorous diets. They were an anomaly, possibly due to their galactic position, but something that required further study and understanding, which we were not granted. In that short time, we learned what we could about them. Hundreds of separate clans lived on their world, with nearly as many different languages spoken. If anything would be a problem for their subjugation, it would be the need for a force to visit every clan and a program to translate every language. Their population was a mere speck compared to the Dominion and the might we could bring to bear, and eventually did. 2 of their planetary orbits later, I returned with the Conquest fleet. Our admiral, a noble and pompous example of our species, had requested me for my first-hand observations. He did not care about their unique nature or what might be gained from their study. He only wished for the honor of enslaving another species for the Dominion. Admiral Tsayuma stood by as we bombarded some of their densest population centers. We didn't wish to destroy their population. It was needed if they were to be a labor race, but to send a lesson, some of them had to be wiped away. Even as we did so, our data experts rapidly invaded their networks, copying and stealing everything they could find, everything we would later learn we needed to study. It is not often that we look back on our mistakes, nor even admit to them. But here we had failed to properly understand our prey and what they would do in response to our actions. It was a response we had never even thought possible, having been united long before we ever reached space. Only moments after our strikes destroyed their cities, great pillars of flame erupted into the sky, and these creatures roared their defiance at us. It was almost laughable that they fired missiles at us. What warhead could damage a starship's shields? It was pitiful. And we watched as those missiles slowly rose, clawing their way on chemical fuel out of their dense gravity well, and we swatted them away by the hundreds, contemptuously. Again, had we understood the nature of our prey, things might have been different. But who had ever thought of such a thing? No species needed to make such weapons as the ones we encountered. All known species had left their gravity wells united. A single solid front as they reached into their heavens and spread amongst the stars. Even then, what use were the weapons we found? The expense of creating them, especially for a divided race such as this, must have been astronomical. There were more efficient ways of bombarding a planet, cleaner ways. A rock from space will impact with even more speed, cause even more destruction, and leave only a crater as its evidence. This race had done something different, something insane. They had harnessed nuclear power and put that onto a missile. A missile that they had never intended to use against another race. A missile intended fully for use within their own atmosphere on their own people. It was insane, but they had done it, and only a short period of time to look would have told us so. Instead, we swatted aside their missiles with contempt, secure in our arrogance that nothing these primitives had could harm us. And as the first of our ships were struck and their shields flashed and flickered away, we were stunned. Surely some accident had happened. Then it happened again, and again, and again, and we watched from our command carrier as almost the entire invasion fleet was wiped away. A disaster that could not be repaired on our admiral's honor. We had no reaction for this, no contingency. This didn't happen. Except there we were, standing on the bridge of our carrier watching as dozens, and then hundreds of warheads blotted away our ships in blinding boils of light. These crazy creatures had harnessed the power of the sun for their weapons, at insane costs, for an insane reason, and we now learned about this at our great cost. Admiral Tsuyuma ended his life before the planetary rotation was over, before even the last of the missiles had detonated, taking with them nearly the entirety of our fleet, leaving all the rest bleeding wrecks, only a few capable of travel. The Admiral's successor had no more direction, no clue on how to react, and so we ran, fleeing from that world's insanity lest another storm of missiles reach up to blot us away, taking away the Dominion's only source of warning. That was what we told ourselves, but it was fear, pure abject horror that drove us. When a predator faces something that it knows cannot be true, that it knows it cannot face and survive, then it runs and waits and comes back another day when it is stronger or more plentiful. We were no different than our ancestors, so we ran, straight back to our emperor, hoping he might have a solution. But that retreat was more of a crawl. Our surviving ships were heavily damaged, and it took nearly a dozen standard planetary cycles to even reach our frontier. That journey gave me something precious, time, the time I had begged for, needed, to understand these creatures. Our databanks survived their attacks, and vast amounts of information we had taken from their networks sat translated before me. Day after day, I pored over their history, their words, and their ideals. I learned what they called themselves, and even the names of their great clans. These humans. And I shuddered at what I discovered. We had interrupted what I can only describe as a cosmic intervention. Our meddling had awakened one of the most violent, fast-breeding species from a self-imposed restraint. The history of the Dominion is filled with short wars, unifications, conquests, and subjugations, but nothing compared to the wars listed in humanity's history. They fought wars over the smallest of things. They fought over rocks, dirt, ideals, and words. They needed only the slightest excuse, and based on their history, humanity would fight over it. Their species had fought so many wars, kept itself so divided, that they were only in their infancy in terms of spaceflight when they should have already been colonizing their neighboring stars. That division had kept us safe. The more I read about them, the more worried I became. If only I had known what they were doing, that worry would have shifted into abject terror. They fought each other, but their stories and histories were filled with tales of enemies uniting to fight a terrible enemy unlike themselves. Even humans that they considered to have stepped beyond acceptable boundaries were united against, like this Hitler person. But now we had justified every fear they had ever had about what existed in the great night sky. 1,000 stories about other races coming to conquer, butcher, or enslave them, and we had done exactly that. The planetary alarms are going off. They're here. I have no more time. My story ends here, but if by some miracle this transmission reaches one of the other empires or confederations out there, heed my words. We have awakened something, and they are not interested in platitudes or terms. We are their bogeyman, and they aim to destroy their fears. Run if you can, hide if you cannot. If you stand, say your farewells to your loved ones, and prepare to meet your gods, for surely they will not stop. Azarian Tell, last intellectual of the Zerax.